All right, people are still trickling in, but it's 2 p.m. So I'll kick us off. Namo haere mai. Welcome to this open Zoom session, looking at the energy industry chapter for the Commission's draft advice to government in the second emissions budget period. We'll open the session with a karakia led by Bevan. So over to you, Bevan.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou I runga I te puaka whakata reo nei, anei te karakia timatanga. E te hui nei, whai a te mātaranga kia marama, kia whai take ngā mahi katoa, tū maia, tū kahu. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna. Haumi e, hui e, tai. Ro tātou.
Thanks, Bevan. Hi, guys. I'm a senior analyst. My name's Hugh Marshall-Tate. I work in the Buildings, Industry, Transport and Energy team at the Climate Change Commission, and I'll be the facilitator for today's session. The Commission began its public consultation for our draft advice to government on April 26, and this will run for 8 weeks until 20th of June. The purpose of today's session is to outline our energy and industry chapter and draft advice. It's an opportunity for you to ask questions and seek clarifications so that you're in a more well-informed position to submit your advice, submit your views as part of this consultation. Engagement is at the heart of what we do, and your submission will help the Commission improve and strengthen our advice to government. Before we get started, I'll just do some housekeeping. In the chat, please write down your name, the community or organisation you represent, and where you are in Aotearoa. It's always nice to know, to see where people are from, and well, we can't see your faces in this format. So today's session will be split into 2 sections. The first section, the team will talk you through the work and the recommendations for about 20 minutes. In the second section, there'll be time for Q&A with the team. Please write your questions in the question and answer box rather than in the general chat. We'll be recording the session and making it available on our website later, along with all the other open Zoom sessions we've had so far and we're going to have over the coming week. That's enough from me. I'll hand over to Ali to take us through this session.
Thanks, Hugh. Ko Alexandra Amos-Eaton Aho. I'm the Acting Manager of the Buildings, Industry, Transport and Energy team. So I'm going to talk to you through some of the energy content. Energy in particular is part of everything we do and is an area of our advice that will affect all New Zealanders. So on behalf of the team, we really appreciate and value the time that you have taken to attend this Zoom and the input that we will receive. It will strengthen and improve our final advice to government. So in terms of structure, I'm going to provide some context for the Commission's work. Next, my colleague Eva will speak to the emissions pricing elements of our advice, as I know this is relevant to a lot of you. Brianna will then speak to the energy and industry context and to the proposed recommendation for energy supply. I'll then take back the reins and talk to you about the proposed recommendation for industrial emissions. And there should be plenty of time after that for Q&A at the end. So first, a reminder of the role of the Climate Change Commission. The Commission was created in 2019 with the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill. We're an independent Crowned entity and we provide regular, independent and evidence-based advice to the government on climate action. Our advice is founded on the science, evidence and analysis that's carried out by our experts on staff, and importantly based on input from stakeholders and the people of Aotearoa New Zealand. And the conclusions and recommendations of the Commission are made by our board, not a government minister or cabinet. So the Commission's role and its tasks are set out in the Climate Change Response Act. This slide here shows the advice that we will give over the next 2 years. In red, you'll see that we're currently consulting on the draft advice to inform the strategic direction of the government's second emissions reduction plan. This plan will cover the years 2026 to 2030, but also beyond. Our final advice is due by the end of the year. It is then the role of the government to consider our advice and decide on the specific policy choices to include in its emissions reduction plan. From 2024, the Commission will provide annual reports assessing progress towards meeting emissions budget and the National Adaptation Plan. In 2024, the Commission will also report on its review of the 2050 target, emissions budget 4, and the review of the inclusion of emissions from international aviation and shipping in the 2050 target. So there is a call of evidence open for these pieces of work at the moment, with more information available on our website. This is the second time that the Commission is providing advice to government for an emissions reduction plan. Our advice looks a little different this time as the context has changed. The government has set an overall emissions budget for the periods 2026 to 2030, and our advice is about the direction of policy required to achieve it and not what that budget should be. Given this, our draft advice is less about modelling and quantitative analysis and more about a qualitative assessment of the direction of policy. The government has also made its first emissions reduction plan. This covers the period 2022 to 2025, and it contains about 400 actions and is still very much in the process of being implemented. Given this, our draft advice is focused on building on the work that's already progressing and not repeating all of our previous advice. To manage this, we've used a prioritisation framework that draws on our Act to decide which elements of advice to raise as proposed recommendations. This prioritisation framework included the potential for how the policy or the opportunity or enabler can help New Zealand meet the second emissions budget period and beyond, any gaps in policy, pace and timing of the action. For example, will the pace be sufficient to contribute to the second emissions period, or will it lay the foundations for achieving future budgets and targets? What risks there are to realising the potential? Any equity considerations, including intergenerational equity, distributional impacts, or specific effects on iwi Māori? Or what co-benefits does the action bring, for example, to health, well-being, economic development, and other environmental or ecological factors? These aspects have been distilled from the matters that we are required to consider under our Act. Overall, the Commission landed on 19 recommendations in total, 2 of which are in our Energy and Industry chapter, 1 is on emissions pricing, and there are also relevant recommendations in our Built Environment chapter, which will be discussed in the Zoom next week. This is fewer recommendations than last time, but in our view, they are more strategic and focused. So we're consulting for 8 weeks on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy for actions Aotearoa must take to meet its climate goals and address climate change. It is then the role of the government of the day to decide on specific policy choices to give effect to the emissions reduction plan. We understand that people are at the heart of policy, and it's important that our advice reflects what the people of Aotearoa New Zealand are experiencing and care about. We want to know if you think that our recommendations reflect what you think is the correct path New Zealand should be on to reduce emissions and meet our legislative targets. So, jumping more into the detail. Meeting emissions budgets requires concerted and timely action across all sectors. Pursuing a range of opportunities will give Aotearoa New Zealand the best chance to deliver on its emission budgets and the 2050 target. This graph shows emissions reductions expected to meet those subsector targets over the first 3 budgets. These figures represent the gap between the government's projected baseline emissions prior to the introduction of policies from the first emissions reduction plan and the sector sub-targets. This chart shows how emissions reductions need to ramp up over time across every sector as actions take effect and scale up. Mostly, this shows a fairly smooth ramping up, but there are a couple of exceptions. To meet the second emissions budget, we anticipate the need for large contributions from electricity generation and process heat. To meet the third emissions budget, we anticipate the need for particularly large contributions from transport. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Eva to talk through the emissions pricing.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Eva Murray. I'm a principal analyst in the Commission's markets team, and I'm going to talk briefly about our draft advice on emissions pricing, which focuses on the emissions trading scheme as the main emissions pricing tool we currently have in New Zealand. We also have some advice in our draft advice in our report about agricultural emissions pricing. That's covered under the agriculture sector. There was a separate Zoom on agriculture, which if you're interested in that, you should check out once it's up on our website. So just to start off, as you will have taken from the graph that Ali just showed, action is needed in every sector to reduce emissions. And of course, this involves, our climate policies. As a result, our climate policies here in Aotearoa New Zealand will need to encourage both decarbonisation and forestry. So, the removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by forests. Both of these things have essential roles to play in our low emissions transition, looking out to the second emissions budget period, but also further out all the way to the 2050 target. So the NZETS is important here as it's a key tool for meeting these budgets and the 2050 target. But as we highlight in our draft advice, it's not actually structured at the moment to deliver both gross emission reductions and the carbon dioxide removals by forests that we need. We've identified two issues why the NZETS is not best structured to deliver both of these things. One is an issue for the nearer term and one for the long term. First, I'll talk about in the nearer term. So by that, we mean over the next 10 years or so, and definitely over the second emissions budget period. We see that the NZETS is likely to drive extensive planting of forests, but minimal gross emission reductions if it's left the way it is. This is simply due to the economics of forestry as compared to the opportunities to reduce emissions at source. Forests can generate carbon dioxide removals at relatively low cost. So this is in the range of sort of $25 to $50 per tonne of carbon dioxide removed. Most gross emission reductions are certainly more expensive than that, over $50 and many over $100 per tonne. The current design of the ETS doesn't distinguish between these two things, so it will just drive the lowest cost options from a financial perspective. It doesn't take into account the non-financial issues that are also very important. These include the equity and wider environmental considerations that come into play when you think about converting large areas of land into forests, and also the different risks and benefits that come from gross emissions reductions and storing carbon in forests. We're already seeing afforestation, taking off in recent years as the carbon prices increased, with around an estimated 60,000 hectares of forests planted last year. This is well above the assumptions the government made when it was setting emissions budgets, which over this decade were more in the range of around 32,000 hectares per year on average each year. The problem with this is that the way the ETS works, the more forests planted and the more carbon dioxide that they remove from the atmosphere, the fewer gross emission reductions the NZETS will deliver. So this is inherent to its design, and it's something that we think needs to be looked at. And this brings me to the second issue here, that in the longer term, so beyond the mid-2030s, the NZETS will not actually provide the incentives for afforestation necessary to achieve net zero long-lived gas emissions by 2050. And this is because not all long-lived gas emissions are actually covered by the ETS. There's a sizable amount of nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture that are not covered. And this means that there will not be enough demand within the scheme to drive all the removals by forests that Aotearoa New Zealand will need to meet its net zero target by 2050. So while this issue is only projected to arise around the mid-2030s, it's something the government needs to start thinking about now, because the drop-off in incentives for forests will start affecting the market well before then, due to the forward-looking nature of the market and the long-term investment horizon of the forestry industry. So next slide, please. So this brings me to our proposed recommendation. This is about the change needed so that emissions pricing, and particularly the NZETS, can support an equitable and sustainable low emissions transition. First, our draft recommendation outlines that the NZETS incentives for gross emission reductions should be separated from those applying to forestry. The point of this is to prevent removals by forests from undermining gross emission reductions over the next 10 years or so, and making sure that ETS can help incentivise reductions of emissions at source. Secondly, we recommend that an approach be developed to maintaining incentives for afforestation past the mid-2030s. And this is to provide the durable incentives needed to reach net zero by 2050. Finally, I'd just like to sort of round this out by emphasising that the way any changes to the NZETS are undertaken is very important. Of course, the ETS affects everyone in New Zealand, and it is particularly, it has many implications for the companies that are directly participating in it. So changes to the ETS will need to be undertaken, or considering any changes to the ETS will need to include careful analysis and thorough consultation by the government. But I'd also really like to emphasise that some iwi and Māori also have a very significant stake in the ETS, particularly when it comes to anything relating to land use. So any government processes and decisions about amending the ETS must recognise the rights of iwi, Māori, and uphold Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. Applying the principles of partnership, protection and participation with iwi Māori will be crucial. So impacts for Māori collective landowners and iwi Māori foresters are understood and properly considered. Okay, now I'll hand over to Brianna, who's probably going to get more into the energy and industry sector specific material.
Thanks, Eva. Kia ora koutou. I'm Brianna Yee, Senior Analyst in the Buildings, Industry and Energy team. Next slide, please. So we know that energy supply and industrial activity underpins our economy, and it's a necessity in the modern world. But these emissions need to significantly reduce in the second emissions budget period and beyond. And as Ali mentioned earlier, these sectors provide the greatest opportunities for reducing emissions in the second budget period, contributing the largest share of reductions, totaling 17.4 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, around 40% of the reductions needed in the second budget period. For this advice, we're proposing 2 recommendations for the energy and industry sector, and these should be read alongside the building recommendations in the built environment chapter. The open Zoom webinar for that chapter is next Tuesday, May 16th at 10 a.m. So please do register on Eventbrite if you're interested. Next slide, please. Our first proposed energy and industry recommendation focuses on ensuring that the electricity system can meet demands of a highly electrified society. We know that electrification is key for decarbonization. This means that more renewable electricity generation will need to be built to both further reduce electricity system emissions and to enable emissions reductions through the electrification of transport, space and water heating, and industry. There's ample generation that could be developed, with Transpower recently reporting around 30 gigawatts of total potential capacity of generation in the pipeline, although much of this is in early stages of investigation. However, we know that policy settings, regulatory constraints related to consenting, and other factors are introducing investment uncertainty and creating build delays. For example, the government has an aspirational target of reaching 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Under the Commission's demonstration path, the system is projected to reach 96% renewable by 2030. While technically feasible, reaching 100% renewable electricity generation by 2030 would likely require some market intervention. It may also come at a significant cost and could increase economy-wide emissions if it led to higher electricity prices, as electrification may be less attractive relative to other fuels. Other factors can also delay build. These include global supply chain issues, as well as labor shortages and developer investment decisions. But regardless of the exact combination of factors, delaying build of renewable generation can indirectly and directly increase emissions. For example, we estimate that a delay of a year could increase emissions on average by 1.8 megatons carbon dioxide equivalent across the second emissions budget period. Build delays can also impact wholesale electricity prices, as more expensive fossil gas and coal generation will be required to meet demand. This could have flow-on effects to the pace of electrification. Increased build will also need to be supported by a robust electricity network. As more households and businesses electrify, electricity distribution networks will need to keep pace to ensure that electricity can be reliably delivered to New Zealanders when and where it is needed. Electricity distribution networks will also need to accommodate more variability in supply and demand, different services, and multi-directional power flows. Improving grid resilience has also become increasingly important. So regulated expenditure forecasting approaches and setting of allowable revenues will need to ensure that lines companies can invest to meet future requirements. And that kind of flexibility must be enabled within the regulated investment environment. There's estimates that realizing the vision of an electrified economy could require an investment of over 40 billion by 2030 across generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure providers to address the historical underinvestment, meet future needs, and to strengthen grid resilience. Energy efficiency and demand-side management also plays a role, and they can be better leveraged to reduce network costs and to support system flexibility. Reducing peak demand defers the need to build a bigger network and improves utilization of existing assets. This can extend the life of network infrastructure, reduce the need for upgrades, and reduce the cost to be recovered from consumers. Next slide, please. So this is why we've proposed that the government prioritize and accelerate renewable electricity generation build and ensure electricity distribution networks can support growth and variability in demand and supply. The government recently launched a consultation on strengthening national direction for renewable electricity generation and transmission infrastructure, and we think this is a great necessary step forward. Recognizing the nationally strategic importance of new and existing renewable electricity generation will be important for providing greater clarity on how to balance conflicting system outcomes and to meet emissions budgets. We know that fossil gas is another important part of the energy transition, and it plays a key role in the broader energy system. Its use will begin to transition out of the system this decade, but will remain important for security of supply and some industrial users across the second budget period and beyond. Fossil gas and coal electricity generation currently fills the gap when hydro inflows are low, or when renewable supply falls short. However, much of the current fossil gas generation operates almost year-round as baseload, and as more renewable generation comes online, the role of fossil gas will transition to one of backing up renewable generation and providing capacity to meet peak demands alongside additional demand response capabilities within the system. And low emissions gases could also play a role. From a chemical point of view, biogas, when refined to biomethane, is identical to fossil gas, and this provides emerging opportunities to decarbonize. But the domestic biogas industry is underdeveloped. Bringing potentially available quantities of biogas to market at affordable prices would require government support and coordination. But available quantities aren't enough to completely replace fossil gas. More work is required to ensure the best use of this limited resource. Hydrogen is also another low emissions fuel that could play a role in reducing emissions across different sectors. However, for most potential uses, we've assessed that there are alternative options which are likely to be more efficient, cheaper, and have less system-wide impacts. For example, using hydrogen for building heating could increase system and consumer costs. We estimate that to convert all existing residential fossil gas users to green hydrogen would require build of 6 large wind farms to produce that hydrogen. If instead their heating was provided by heat pumps, then only one of these large wind farms would be required. That said, some industrial processes will require low emissions hydrogen to decarbonize. For example, urea and methanol production, primary steelmaking, or some very high temperature processes that are best served by a combustible fuel. There are also other opportunities to reduce emissions from energy supply. For example, by addressing fugitive emissions from the production, transmission, and storage of fossil fuels, non-productive combustion, or from geothermal power generation. However, the evidence base on these sources and emissions reduction opportunities could be improved. I'm going to hand it over to Ali now to take you through some of the industrial activities and opportunities in that space.
Wonderful, thanks Brianna. So industrial emissions come from the combustion of fossil fuels for energy, chemical reactions which occur in industrial processes. For example, fossil gas and coal are combusted for process heat in sectors such as food processing and wood, pulp and paper production. Oil is used in off-road vehicles and machinery in the mining and construction sectors, and industrial process emissions come primarily from the production of cement, steel and aluminium. So rapidly reducing industrial emissions is crucial to meeting the second emissions budget, and this is what our second proposed recommendation is targeting. There are cost-effective options that are available now, and the government's work program is helping to unlock these opportunities. However, our assessment is that there is a risk that the government has overestimated how quickly reductions from process heat can be achieved. The combined impact of policies outlined in the government's first emission reduction plan range from 12 to 20 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent during the second emissions budget period. So for the higher estimate to be achieved, what that means is that all coal, fossil gas and diesel industrial boilers would have had to be converted to electricity or biomass by 2025, and this is very unlikely to be plausible. The rate at which industrial emissions can be reduced is limited by several factors. For example, fuel switching decisions involve long-lived assets with high upfront capital costs. The GIDI Fund is currently addressing some capital cost barriers, and continual assessment and readjustment of the fund to ensure that it is well targeted will support continued emissions reductions in line with budgets. Identification of alternative policy measures could also be beneficial. The New Zealand ETS can drive much of the decarbonisation of energy supply and industrial activity, so maintaining an effective carbon price signal into the future is important. But to continue unlocking cost-effective ways to rapidly reduce industrial emissions, the government needs to address other non-cost barriers. For example, there are limited manufacturers of biomass or electrode boilers in the country, continued supply chain delays for key equipment like transformers, and ongoing labour and skills constraints. Given that bioenergy and electrification, given the role that bioenergy and electrification plays in decarbonisation globally, Aotearoa New Zealand will be competing internationally to acquire these resources. This can impact the pace of emissions reductions, especially when coupled with the limits on shutdown periods for plant conversions and business funding and planning cycles. Other barriers include electricity distribution business processes, onerous consenting, uncertainty about future pricing and technologies, practical engineering constraints, and an underdeveloped biomass market. Security and cost of electricity and bioenergy supply will be critical in enabling the decarbonisation of process heat. But there is uncertainty around the ability of biomass supply, alongside growing competition for its use. Improved coordination and a strategic assessment of the best use of bioenergy, including where the fuel should be used and for what purpose, could be useful. Industrial conversions to electricity will add pressure to the electricity system. There is significant variation in the resources and systems of electricity distribution businesses, and this can lead to project delays, especially if a network upgrade is triggered. As well as process heat, other opportunities to reduce industrial emissions could be pursued, such as large industrial users in chemical production. The technology for industries with hard to debate emissions is still developing, and the government could look into the role of what policy is required to accelerate this. And in the meantime, incremental emissions reductions should be encouraged. Other opportunities which have not had much attention to date include off-road vehicles and machineries. Building the evidence base on emissions reduction opportunities and enabling policies for these industrial activities could also be useful. So as such, we have recommended that the government pursue more widespread process heat decarbonisation and establish mechanisms in other industrial sectors and processes to decarbonise. And with that, I will hand back to Hugh. You're on mute, Hugh.
It had to happen sometime. The floor is open for questions. Please put them in the Q&A box. I'll kick us off with one to Ellie. Your gas connections ban for buildings seems inconsistent with the message that fossil gas plays a critical role in the energy system, including backing up renewables. Please explain.
Cool. It's a good first question. There's a short answer and a long answer to that one. The short answer is, and also, so that's also relevant to the Zoom that's happening next week, but I think it's relevant to both Zooms. So it's a good one for me to cover off in a little bit of detail, I think. So the short answer is that fossil gas will begin to transition out of the system over the next few decades. And that means that it has to be carefully managed in this process. What that also means is that it is going to have to be, I guess, prioritised for the most high value users. And we think that is for electricity generation and for high temperature process heat users, as opposed to in some of the residential and commercial sectors where there's a obvious technological alternative, for example, heat pumps. The longer answer to that question is how we came to the recommendation regarding fossil gas use in buildings. And hold on, I'll just read it out to you for those because it's not part of this Zoom. So yeah, that was to prohibit the new installation of fossil gas in buildings where there are affordable and technically viable alternatives in order to safeguard consumers from the costs of locking in new fossil gas infrastructure. And that was also coupled with a recommendation about incentivising retrofits. So the two recommendations worked together. We balanced a number of things when thinking about this recommendation. For example, we know that some industries, for example, like restaurants and kitchens, that they do struggle with alternatives. We also, we know that electricity distribution businesses, some of them, depending what their demand load looks like in the country, they're already under a lot of pressure with EVs coming online and as process heat electrifies. I think that's more of a phasing thing rather than a strategic use of fossil gas question. But on the other hand, what's really driving this recommendation for us is about intergenerational equity. It's about, in a world where fossil gas use is declining, and the use of green gases is still very much uncertain, making sure that we're not locking in new assets and protecting consumers from higher future energy prices as emissions pricing may increase. Green gases are considerably more expensive at the moment. We also thought about the co-benefits and the negative impacts of using fossil gas in homes, and so that's in particular links to childhood asthma, for example. So that's just a bit of a summary about our thought process on that one. I'll hand back to you, Hugh.
Awesome. Thanks. Still waiting for questions to come in. Here's one for Brianna. So Brianna, the question is, what causes the big drop in industrial process heat emissions in 2029 in your forecasts?
So the projection that you see in the context slide for energy and industry, there's a drop in the emissions from low to medium temperature process heat, primarily stemming from the food processing sector. That answers your question.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that answers the question. Okay, we've got another one here around recommendation 14. So should recommendation 14 be more specific? For example, recommend specifically specific industries get targeted, or specific industries to target a particular transformation or a mechanism for use.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Cool.
Yes, so if you think that'd be valuable, I think that's a really good thing to submit. When we're putting together the recommendations, you know, there were various iterations. Some of them, they were more specific. It was just like where we landed in terms of trying to be consistent across all of the Commission's recommendations in terms of level of detail. But I definitely see where you're coming from. So if that's something that you feel strongly about, yeah, please put that in your submission.
Cool, thanks. All right. Probably another one for you, Ellie. You mentioned the possibility of biogas and the role of bioenergy. Is there a reason you aren't leaning into how these resources should be distributed?
I wonder if that question is potentially getting towards why we're not more specific about allocating where we think the best use is. I think when we looked at this, like, you know, when we look at our prioritization framework and how we carry out the analysis, we looked at the second emissions budget period and where we saw the big opportunities were, for example, and then also some of the other things I mentioned earlier on. And we coupled that with what we had heard from stakeholder engagement in our earlier engagement last year. And we identified it as an area that we think that there can be merit in looking into this further, but it's not, I guess, the Commission's role to be getting into that detail in terms of like, that's quite a detailed level in the policy sense. So I think my perspective is that's over to government in particular to have a closer look at, if I have interpreted your question properly.
Okay, yeah, I will move on to the next question. So the next question is around, so basically what it sees is fossil fuels aren't the problem, it's the emissions. What's your view on that, Brianna?
Not my personal view, but the Commission's view. So the application of CCS is still emerging globally, and it's difficult to assess the potential and the cost for the Aotearoa New Zealand context, as it's largely still in a fairly research and concept stage in New Zealand. So this is likely because forestry remains a lower cost emissions removal option, and because low emissions substitutes for fossil fuel combustion for energy. They're increasingly economic under current policy settings. Additionally, current legislation isn't adequate to manage the risks and long-term liability associated with a CCUS operation. It would be important to think quite carefully and to undertake a proper policy development process before deciding what that legislation would be, but also if there should be NZUs issued under the NZETS as a other type of removal activity. There could be a role for CCUS to play in addressing hard to abate residual emissions in the medium term and for achieving net negative emissions in the long term. However, that would require that enabling regulatory framework to be in place over the next decade or so.
Cool, thanks. Another one for you, Brianna. do we have an enabling environment for more electrification or more renewable generation build?
So I would say this is encompassed in our proposed recommendation on electricity to prioritize and accelerate that build. So largely, we think that the market can deliver the required level of build that is required to support electrification of transport, heat, and industry. And there are a variety of barriers that need to be addressed to prevent further delay. And as we noted, and as outlined in our report and some charts and analysis, there are direct and indirect emissions consequences to continued delay of build. But if there are additional feedback or other concerns or barriers that the sector would like to share with Commission, please do feel free to include that in your submission on the consultation.
Cool. Okay, and then again, another one on sort of electricity sector issues. Brianna, you noted that the regulated allowances are a current barrier to the electricity network development needed. Has the Climate Change Commission considered how best to address this beyond regulatory change, but like the distribution approach to planning and investment and delivery?
Thanks, Hugh. So that's slightly outside our remit and our role in terms of providing strategic direction of policy. However, we would like to note that the Electricity Networks Association and their network transformation roadmap has been developed for and by EDBs. And that provides quite a lot of information and insights and actions for supporting lines companies in kind of navigating the net zero kind of transition. And that includes kind of working together more closely and kind of leveraging economies of scale, whether that's acquiring the necessary digital platforms to support emerging ways of producing or using electricity, or kind of sharing, or it was proposed in our supplementary report by DITA Consulting, kind of bulk purchasing transformers to kind of get ahead of potential demand. So outside the regulatory space, there's quite a lot of opportunity for collaboration, especially among the smaller lines companies. But in terms of our role and the kind of, I guess, like specific actions for EDBs, it's not, we don't have specific ones. Thanks.
So thank you. Okay. Here's another question, probably for Ellie. Are there investments we can make now that enable other industrial categories, industrial process, motor power, to reduce emissions and emissions budgets for free? So this is a bit outside of our advice. The thought is that maybe I thought maybe that was the recommendation, but it didn't end up as one of the 19 proposed recommendations.
Right.
That's what the question says.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I think that lots of the investments that we can make now to enable, decarbonisation of other categories, it's really about making sure, well, actually, I have a couple of points. One of them is about making sure that the system can support really high levels of electrification, particularly if you have very large users coming online. In terms of things like off-road vehicles and mining vehicles and stuff, there hasn't been a huge amount of policy work or research into what the options are for decarbonising those sectors. They're likely to be transport, particularly I'm thinking for off-road vehicles, they're likely to be transport type options. Like I'm thinking like use of hydrogen or biomass or biofuels in powering those. So while there hasn't been a lot of work in this space to date, it's about setting like the systems and the infrastructure up to be able to support the decarbonisation. And so I think that those are kind of like no-brainer investments that could happen in the second emissions budget period. The other thing is about really tackling those hard to abate sectors and not missing the emissions reductions that can happen while we're waiting for the technology to evolve to the point that hopefully we can get some big reductions. And those are things like efficiency improvements and incremental improvements where they're possible. And I think it's really important to emphasize that those shouldn't be missed.
Yeah, totally. All right. Some more questions. Yeah, we'll just wait for a few more to come through. All right. Okay. We've got one here that reads, the National Party has suggested they would eliminate the Giddy Fund. Is there a way to ensure that these policies endure regardless of which party is in power?
Yeah, cool. I'll take that one.
Cool.
So first of all, it's not our place to comment on particular policies in terms of how they are tackled by the government of the day, which this is, I guess, why the Commission was created in the first place. So we think out past electoral cycles, so out at this stage out to 2050, and the idea being that if as many parties as possible can jump on board with the direction that we need to head, and then it's up to the specific policy of the day in terms of how to achieve those budgets. With like big policies like the Giddy Fund, and then there's obviously examples in like transport, for example, like the clean car policies. The actual policies of themselves are not necessarily the things that's important. It's the outcomes that is achieved. If there is another sort of policy that would achieve the same outcome, that's the prerogative of the government. That you've just always got to think, like from our point of view, and we'll be thinking about this when we get into our monitoring next year, is if not that, then what?
Yeah, absolutely. More of an announcement. There was a question that came in around the kind of the list of consultation questions for the sort of without going to the Citizen Space website. And in response to that, I'll just announce that we're going to have an offline submission pack that will be available. And if you're interested in that, just email the hello@climatecommission.gov.nz email address, and we'll put you on a list to receive that pack when it's available. It should be available soon. Okay, here's one. Brianna, is there any consideration as to how the embodied carbon impacts of constructing more renewable energy generation today balances out against the operational emissions reduced in the future?
Thank you. So we haven't undertaken internal analysis comparing operational against embodied carbon of different forms of infrastructure. But we do know that infrastructure, and that's broadly whether it's transport assets or renewable electricity generation infrastructure, it is part of the solution when reducing emissions and meeting emissions budgets. So we note, and we discuss this a little bit more in our built environment chapter, which we'll discuss next Tuesday. But we advise that when decisions are made in the design and build of infrastructure, whether that's transport, for instance, roads, or for renewable electricity infrastructure, concerning the whole of life of that piece can help reduce system-wide impacts. And also if you make use of existing infrastructure and make it more resilient to the effects of climate change, it can reduce the pressure on resources required for construction, and it can avoid some of the emissions associated with building. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question. We do advise also that in an Aotearoa, our emissions budgets are monitored and accounted for from a production-based accounting lens. So our recommendations and our analysis is based on a production-based accounting system.
Yeah. Thank you. To either of you, you noted that biogas is currently underdeveloped. Where would biogas projects be needed? Where would biogas projects need to get for the CCTC to have more confidence in biogas as an option?
Okay, first I think it's good to discuss that biogas in the past 3 years, so since we released an Aotearoa when there was basically no New Zealand-based evidence on biogas, and I know that that's different to the rest of the world, which has been using biogas for a long time now. So there's been massive progress made in the last 3 years. From our point of view, though, primarily, let me rephrase that. Biogas, having been a one-for-one swap for fossil gas, there is an amazing opportunity there. We just don't have enough, evidence from a variety of sources about how much is actually possible and at what prices, and how that's going to impact consumers. I know that there's been lots of work underway, and the gas transition plan that the GIC are leading, that they've thought about biogas as well. So I think it's not that we don't have confidence in biogas. I think it's a great opportunity. We don't think that there is enough there, though, to justify expanding the current gas network. So I think that's possibly where maybe a bit of the rub is. But also, yeah, we always love to hear more evidence, particularly if we think it's going to help solve the problem.
Yeah, an appropriate time would be that for that call for evidence that's currently open, right? We can build out evidence space for our budgets with. Yeah, all the current consultation.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, unless there's any further comments, I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks for all your time today. Just a kind of final reminder that the public consultation will close on the 20th of June. And our draft advice, as well as the recordings for other Zooms, are available on the Commission's website and our YouTube channel. So, big thanks to all the speakers today. And I'll hand. And we look forward to receiving your submissions through the Citizens Space portal. And I'll hand over to Bevan for our closing karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou whai wāhi I tēnei rā, anei te karakia wakamutunga. Ka hiki te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki ai te ao marama. Haumi e hui e tai ki. Tēnā tātou. Oh, just for a translation, in case you're interested in that, restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched and unified. Thanks again. Kia ora tātou.